Sisters and brothers, comrades and friends, in the next few days, in the weeks leading up to Christmas, local authorities around the country will be announcing more savage cuts to local services. Already under this Tory-led coalition, some 6 out of 10 councils are either limiting or planning to limit the home visits to the elderly with care needs to a maximum of 15 minutes. 16% of Sure Start children's centres have closed, 8% of libraries, youth clubs, street wardens, many of the services which act as glue to hold together local communities have already gone, together with thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs of those providing those services as part of 26% cut in local authority spending during the lifetime of this Parliament, but it's not enough for the coalition. George Osborne announced at the Tory party conference only weeks ago a further 10% cut in local authority funding in the first year of the next Parliament, and Her Majesty's loyal opposition loyally agreed to carry and match those cuts pound for pound. Now, those services could have been, can be saved if councils and councillors, they have the power to make a difference. They control budgets of billions of pounds. They've got some £19 billion in reserves, but only if councillors like we heard of this weekend, Keith Morrell, Don Thompson from Southampton, prepared to fight, prepared to say no to the cuts. Now, there are isolated examples of that in Southampton, in Warrington, in Hull, in Harrow. There's been an abstention in Lambeth. There's been a resignation in York, another resignation in Barking. There's TUSC's own councillors in Preston, in Walsall and Maltby. But compared to the 6,837 Labour councillors across this country, whose only defence is that they're carrying out the cuts with a heavy heart, that's no consolation to the victims of those cuts up and down Britain. It's also nothing compared to the history of when socialists were on councils. In Poplar, in Tower Hamlets in 1921, when socialists raised unemployment pay rates rather than subsidise richer boroughs in London and were jailed for refusing to obey the government of the day. But they're remembered today when the government ministers who jailed them are forgotten because of their maxim, it's better to break the law than to break the poor. Or the Labour councillors in the tiny town of Claycross 50 years later, 11 Labour councillors in 1972 who refused to raise the rents that the Heath Tory government instructed them to do so, instead raised the wages of council workers. They were surcharged. They were barred from office by the Labour Party. They were banned from office by the High Court. But as the chair of housing in Claycross said, if we're going, at least we're going with a record. And in the 1980s, just like the speakers in that film Spartacus, when, by the way, Claycross councillors were banned from office, a succession of local people from the local community came forward to stand in their place. That would be the lesson today to any Labour council or councillors prepared to stand up. And the battle perhaps in which this party played in its forerunner organisation, the greatest of roles, that of Liverpool in the 1980s, when 47 brave Labour councillors, 1/3 of them supporters of the militant newspaper, refused to make Thatcher's cuts and instead established the real needs of their city and built 5,000 houses, built schools, parks and sports centres, gave employment to thousands of workers, and was savagely attacked by Neil Kinnock in 1985 as a Labour council scuttling around the city handing out redundancy notices, even though no one, and I repeat, no one, during the 3 years of the socialist control of Liverpool Council actually lost their jobs. Where's Neil Kinnock today when there are 77 Labour councils who are axing jobs, who are cutting pay, who are cutting conditions. Those councils are a disgrace. So, what do we do next May? What do we do next May when 4,156 seats on 160 councils come up? Do we leave the only choice for working people between the parties of the establishment who differ nothing on the direction of austerity, but only marginally on the speed that those cuts should be made? TUSC has decided that working people deserve better. TUSC plans to stand next May, on the 22nd of May 2014, the largest number of candidates to the left of the establishment parties ever stood in an election in the history of this country. Now, we've only been going 4 years, and you've heard the joke before. When I first Googled TUSC in 2010, the top result on Google was the Taunton Ukulele Strummers Club. Not that now. We've stood nearly 600 candidates in the last 4 years in local and national elections, received over 100,000 votes. Some of those individual results are modest. I'm going to say it before anybody else does. We know we got less than 1% in Eastbourne. We know we got less than 1% in Lincoln. And by-elections are the toughest terrain a new political party can fight in. So I want to pay tribute and say thanks to each one of those candidates, whatever result they got, for flying the flag of TUSC in those elections. But you know, within minutes of getting less than 1% in Eastbourne and Lincoln, Owen Jones tweeted joyfully how TUSC was a waste of time. But when a week after Lincoln, we got 9.7% in Caerphilly, or 27% in Fleetwood, or we win a seat just outside Rotherham, then Twitter and Facebook are silent from our colleagues on the left. Now, part of our problem is general visibility. Other factors as well, as by-elections are unfavourable terrain. There are objective conditions which are difficult the nearer we get to a general elections. We know you don't win elections in the 3 weeks of a by-election, except in exceptional circumstances or with very large budgets. You harvest the votes in those 3 weeks from the seeds you've sown in the months before that campaign. But visibility is a problem. The only national TV interview we've had in 4 years of existence has been 2 minutes 14 seconds I had with Andrew Neil on the Daily Politics in the general election 2010. So we need to raise our sights and stand sufficient candidates so the BBC in particular and the media in general can't ignore us. That's 15% of seats in an election. The benchmark at which the BBC grants a party political broadcast. Not only that broadcast, but also what they term as fair electoral coverage on local radios and regional TVs. 15% of seats next May is 625 contests. 4 times as many as TUSC has ever stood in previous council elections. Now, the work for that has begun. Meetings from Plymouth all the way to Sheffield. Committees established on Merseyside and elsewhere. Visits to union branches and community organisations. We think we've got already 1/3 to 1/2 of seats with prospective candidates who've come forward. Now, we need to find ways of discussing, especially with the trade unions whose representatives sit on the TUSC steering committee, and the anti-bedroom tax campaigns, the anti-cuts organisations and other community groups, to ensure that in every town and every city where there are elections next May, Labour can't hide behind its synthetic opposition to austerity cuts, and a real socialist alternative is on offer. Let me finish with this point. We're not even halfway through the plans of the programme of austerity that the capitalist class has for working people in this country, to save their banks and their profit system. Osborne at the Tory conference also said 7 more years to the beginning of the 2020s with his plans for cuts. In reality, they're using the excuse of austerity to rewrite the map of social provision in Britain, to reverse the gains in public supply of education, health, social and welfare services of the post-war period. And there's no challenge from Her Majesty's loyal opposition. No challenge to more cuts in welfare, more rising costs of pensions and reduction in payouts, more years of young people going on the scrap heap or trapped in dead-end jobs or saddled with £50,000 of college debts. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is still the richest, sixth richest country on the planet, if what we had was more fairly distributed. Labour and Tory governments since 2008 have committed £141 billion to repairing the damage to the banking system caused by 2008's financial crash. Over the same period from 2008 to today, the top 1,000 individuals in this country have seen their wealth rise by £138 billion. Their lives are enriched by austerity, while millions of our folk live in a street with a food bank at the end of it. If the division of wealth, last point, if the division of wealth in Britain was only the same as it was a generation ago, the average wage would be £7,000 a year higher than it is today. And the gap between the rich and the rest wouldn't be accelerated. Now, there's a single narrative in British politics today. Their crisis has to be paid for by our austerity, our youth clubs, our libraries, our elderly care, our health and education. TUSC intends to challenge that with a socialist alternative. Help us find the candidates for next year. Thanks a lot.